Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Rachel Hansen, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the presenter at the end of the program. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions before we end today. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter. Peter Simons is a historian of the U.S. environment of Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, and also serves as project manager for the New York 6 Liberal Arts Consortium. His forthcoming book, Global Heartland, Cultivating the American Century on the Midwestern Farm, will be published by the University of Minnesota Press in spring 2025. Global Heartland explores how Midwestern farmers came to see themselves as international citizens during the 1940s, first by helping feed overseas allies during the war, and then by helping to stave off famine after the war ended, and ultimately helped build the American century. His work on the Flying Farmers, which appeared in agriculture history, came out of this larger project and helped illustrate the personal sense of obligation and opportunity to rebuild the world that many Midwesterner farmers experienced after World War II. And now I'm happy to turn over to Peter to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's really a delight to be here today. It's a unique opportunity in part because the research that I did for this project was published almost 10 years ago. And so it's sometimes a humbling process to revisit something that you worked on quite a while ago, the amount of things that you've forgotten, but especially I'm sure as many of you have encountered, historical research has changed so much, even in the last 10 years. So all of these sources that 10 years ago I had to go in person to the Library of Congress to find, there's just a vastly multiplied portion of these things that are available online now. So there's this continuous sense of disappointment that if I had had all of these things 10 years ago, a much different project would have perhaps developed. But it also means that there are many more things that I was able to tap into for today's presentation. I want to start by talking about this organization, the Flying Farmers, by looking at someone who was not himself an actual member of the organization, but is arguably the most famous flying farmer among the most famous Iowans and probably one of the most divisive Iowans as well. And that is Henry Wallace. At the time, Henry Wallace was serving his final term as Franklin Roosevelt's vice president. And in May of 1944, Roosevelt sent Wallace on a 50-day mission that would take him through Canada, Alaska, the Soviet Union, and eventually down to China. Ostensibly, the purpose of this was to confer with American allies. For example, you can see here Wallace speaking with Chiang Kai-shek in China. The reason that he was in China was to reassure Chiang Kai-shek that the US had his back against communist Chinese forces opposed to him, but also against a threat he perceived from the Soviet Union as well. So there was a diplomatic mission that was motivating this trip on its surface. And one thing I want to take a moment to pause from, this is from a scrapbook of Wallace's trip, and you'll notice very much like a tourist, there's always some appendage of an airplane lurking in the background. So although these sorts of diplomatic trips were nothing uncommon at the time, the central part played by the airplane looms over the entire thing. The other reason that Wallace went on this trip was to investigate the operation of Lend-Lease. Now, Lend-Lease was a program begun in 1941, meant to supply war material to US allies. This was supposed to prevent the United States from needing to actually become a direct combatant in World War II by sharing arms, by sharing food, to be able to feed the British, the Russians. Obviously, it did not prevent the United States from entering the war later that year, but what it did do is jumpstart American production, and that benefited Midwestern farmers in particular, who earlier had been still building back from the crush of the Great Depression and saw Lend-Lease as a sudden surge in demand for their goods. And so part of that was taking this route that would go, again, from Minneapolis in the United States, very slowly, airport by airport, landing at places like this one in Siberia, these metal ribbed airports that would be shipped and then laid out roughly every 200 miles so that American planes could ferry goods, but then also oftentimes the planes themselves would stay in the Soviet Union for use as cargo planes by the Soviet Union. So every day, Wallace and his traveling companions would go about 800 miles, stopping at these sorts of airports along the way that had been specially created for Lend-Lease. Now, I need to pause for a moment and acknowledge there's a side story here as well. I mentioned a moment ago, this was, of course, Henry Wallace's last term as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. And so the suspicion is that Roosevelt purposely sent Wallace on this thousands of miles long journey out of any sort of communication with Washington, because that was when he was choosing Harry Truman to replace Wallace on the ticket for the 1944 presidential election. So it's a bit of a disgrace. This is the moment in which Henry Wallace's political career essentially dies. It's also part of an episode that some of you may be familiar with, in which this trip that goes through Siberia takes Wallace and his traveling companions directly through the Soviet Gulag. And a lot of what the Gulag was focused on in Siberia was gold mining. And they were using Lend-Lease equipment, excavators, for example, built in Ohio, to dig for gold. And this was explicitly prohibited by the terms of Lend-Lease. Wallace and his traveling companions saw that. It's not clear if they understood that they were seeing prison camps along the way, but nonetheless, this would be another blemish on Wallace's career, so much so that in the 1950s, he would come back to it, writing an article where I was wrong, essentially asking for forgiveness for the content of this trip, of ignoring the things that he had seen along the way. But despite the fact that he was essentially flying on a route to his political grave, what's more interesting, and the reason that I want to start with this story, is that Wallace saw himself not so much as the vice president on this mission, but as an Iowan farmer trying to spread the agricultural knowledge that he had and see what he could gain from his counterparts in the Soviet Union and China. As he was leaving, he said that he, quote, wanted to feel the grandeur that comes when men wisely work with nature. And in a press conference, he was asked, what are you going to China to talk to Chiang Kai-shek for? And this, obviously, he couldn't, because China was an ally at the time, because the Soviet Union was an ally, he couldn't say he was reassuring Chiang Kai-shek that the Soviet Union would support him against any outside influence. So instead, he said, he looked down at his calloused hands and he said, I'm going to China to introduce the use of the push hoe to Chinese farmers. So he's always focused on this agricultural purpose of the mission. And when he left, from Minneapolis, which you can see in the bottom right portion of the map that was published in a travelogue recounting this mission. He left from Wold Chamberlain Field in Minneapolis. He asked his brother James to have a crate of chicks waiting on the runway that he could put into his C-54 that he was flying to the Soviet Union, so that he could take those chicks. He was taking livestock, he was taking seeds, he was taking yearbooks of agriculture published by the USDA that he intended to distribute all the way along this route. In some ways, this seems really peculiar because if Henry Wallace's heart is in Iowa, he's a corn farmer, he's dealing with a totally different climate here. And so this is one of the things that the flying farmers, when they become an organization, begin looking toward as well. That the airplane is not just a tool of transport, but that it's breaking down these climatological barriers that had limited what had been possible before. So as Wallace flies along, he's taking these pictures. For example, the top picture, again, this is from his scrapbook that's kept at the University of Iowa. It's of a permafrost silo. And he's seeing things in Siberia and saying, this is something that we could take back to Alaska and encourage Midwestern farmers who can't get land in Minnesota, for example. They can move up to Alaska, start over again, and they can copy the things that the Soviet farmers are doing in Siberia. Again, he doesn't know that most of those Soviet farmers are farming against their will, but it's the technical aspect that he wants to take back with him as well. In Alaska, he visits these greenhouses growing things like cucumbers and rhubarb, and seeing these as an opportunity for a new agricultural regime that basically would stretch from Canada up to the Arctic Circle and back down to Siberia. He sees this as sort of a unifying ability of plants that would be bridged together by the sorts of air travel that he's undertaking in his mission to Soviet Asia. So he's walking around Siberia. He keeps noting all of these tokens of the Midwest. He sees blue pasque flowers, which is the state flower of South Dakota. He sees Pennick and Ford corn oil cans made in Cedar Rapids. You see bags of Pillsbury flour from Minneapolis. And he keeps, on each city he visits, he compares it to its American counterpart. So he's in a place called Chita, and he said, this is basically Duluth in Siberia. Or he's in a place called Ulan-Ude and says, this is essentially the Soviet version of Des Moines. He keeps making these connections between these places. And he notes the landscape, again, from the airplane. In this case, the wing is cropped out. He's copying the mission of the USDA as it had started its aerial surveillance of rural America to see how land is being used. He's looking out at China and similarly thinking, how can we use this aerial vision to make sense of agriculture in the Soviet Union and China? What can we bring back to the United States? Now, the people he was traveling with, notably officials from the State Department and other agencies of the US government, they become really frustrated with Wallace. In part, they see him as a little bit of a loose cannon. He gets booted from the presidential ticket, after all. But they're concerned that he's spending way too much time talking about agriculture. Owen Lattimore, who was a China expert, complained that Wallace was spending so much time on agriculture that there was no time for diplomacy. And in Western China, he noted that Wallace was primarily focused on, quote, soybeans, strawberries, fruits, rainfall, and irrigation, and that he actually didn't end up talking about the essential diplomatic targets that had been set for him by the State Department. Agriculture remains his primary focus. And part of this is going back to that greenhouse image because Wallace has a cornucopian vision. Now, immediately after the war, there are several different books that are written saying we're going to have a third world war. And part of the reason is there's not enough food in the world. There are all of these people, many of them are suffering because of the outcome of the war. They don't have access to fresh food anymore, particularly in Europe. And others simply said the population is getting too big. We can't feed them all. And Wallace sees something totally different. He goes to Alaska, he goes to Siberia, and he says, no, we can provide as much food as we need to the rest of the world. And again, aviation is the thing that's going to connect all these things to him. He has this sort of untiring optimism. Most would call it a naivete. But that optimism is also rooted in what contemporaries refer to as an air-mindedness. This is something the popular press would bandy about in the time, that Americans were becoming more and more attuned to the reality of air travel. World War II, after all, was a war in which air combat played a central role. And so there was this belief that airplanes would be able to overcome all of these physical obstacles that had divided humans. The pilot of the C-54 Skymaster that Wallace and his traveling companions used to make that trip even had this vision for himself. He painted near the nose of the airplane this polar bear image, and he and his Soviet counterpart pledged that after the war, they were going to create a polar bear airline that would enable this connection between Alaska and the Soviet Union to take advantage of the narrow strait that was dividing the two countries and help ferry goods and people back and forth more easily. Wallace thought that this would pull the countries of the world together, much like the 48 states had been pulled into the United States. And even though Wallace was flying on what at the time was a comparatively large four-engine aircraft, he thought that because of all of those runways with the corrugated iron slats, the fact that those were every 200 miles, he said that even an ordinary farmer with a quote unquote jitney airplane could fly and land every 200 miles, so that somebody who's raising hogs in Iowa would be able to take that same route that he did and sell them to buyers in Siberia. Obviously, on the face of it, that doesn't strike you as terribly practical. But again, Wallace's optimism is shining through what he thought the future might lie for aviation. And he's not alone. In the same year that Wallace makes this trip, 1944, an organization called the Oklahoma Flying Farmers is formed at Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State University, in Stillwater. 1944, the war's not even done yet, but already there's this vision towards what's happening after the war and how new technologies can be integrated into farming. And this isn't just a small college interest organization. This is something that captures the attention of state and federal officials. The Minnesota Commissioner of Aeronautics claimed that the Flying Farmers, as the group became National Flying Farmers, as they became known soon after other states began forming their own branches, that this organization would form the backbone of an emerging United States aviation empire. Those are the words that he used, aviation empire. And the International Flying Farmers still exists today. There are still active chapters. They still have their annual fly-ins and elect kings and queens. Though certainly it's not at the core of anything that would resemble an aviation empire. And they've never grown beyond the peak of members that they had in the late 1940s. And so with the rest of the time that we have today, I want to answer this question: who exactly were the flying farmers? And where did they come from? Why did this organization emerge when it did? What did they think they were doing? Again, this is something more than just a interest organization. It's not just people who want to fly recreationally. They have a vision for what aviation will do for agriculture. And then finally, where are they now? Why essentially did that mid-century vision of an aviation empire never come to pass? So after starting out in Oklahoma in 1944, other states, primarily in the Midwest and Great Plains, quickly form their own chapters, and the Oklahoma Flying Farmers rebrand as the National Flying Farmers. By 1950, there were 20,000 members across the United States. And they become, with their own language, an almost evangelical group. They feverishly share their mission of spreading aviation throughout the countryside. They start their own magazine, the National Flying Farmer, and they're able to get articles placed in a wide variety of publications. Here, this is from the trade publication printed by the International Harvester Corporation, appearing in 1949. It depicts a farm family who is using their airplane to fly into Des Moines, where they can complete their errands in the city and then fly back to their own farm. They also appear in magazines like National Geographic, Look, Time magazine. So this is not just something that rests within a sort of niche of farmers in the Midwest. This becomes sort of a national phenomenon and appears in magazines read by a much wider range of people. Part of spreading the word about this organization goes beyond print to yearly meetings. Here's an appearance in Look magazine from 1952. They have these fly-ins, both at the state level and at the national level. This one is in Kansas, taking place at the Hutchinson Municipal Airport. Here's a farmer coming in for a landing, but more interestingly, the fly-in in Hutchinson in 1946 included a refrigerated version of the same airplane that Henry Wallace took to the Soviet Union and China. And this one, as you can see, says it was loaded with 18,000 pounds of Hawaiian pineapples, mangoes, and then strawberries, cantaloupes, and cherries from California. And these things were then to be sold in Hutchinson. And the appeal here, of course, is that this would open up new markets that hadn't existed for farmers before. Obviously, if you're a corn farmer, if you're a wheat farmer, shipping historically hadn't been the same sort of issue that it had been for, say, dairy farmers who have a fairly limited geographical constraint on where they can send fluid milk. Similarly, fruit farmers, for example, on the western shore of Michigan, have a very small catchment area of where they can sell the blueberries and other things that they're growing at the time. And so by using this refrigerated airplane, the flying farmers are arguing that there's a new world of marketing that could potentially open up for farmers, that they're going to be able to sell things to distant markets, that they'll be able to get better prices than they could before. And part of the appeal here is you wouldn't just rely on wholesalers or other freight haulers like this large C-54. The argument was that individual farmers could use their own small planes, the jitney planes that Wallace referred to, and bring their own goods to market themselves. So again, if you were, for example, a blueberry farmer in Benton Harbor, Michigan, you would be able to, at the ripest moment, take those blueberries directly to New York City and get the best price that you could and avoid the intermediaries that you had historically needed to sell to before. So there's a sense of opportunity. There's a sense of greater income that would be coming because of this. There's a sense of freedom that hadn't existed for many farmers before. In the same way that Wallace sees the geographical constraints dividing the Soviet Union and the United States, the flying farmers are seeing those same constraints being broken down because of aviation, opening up new markets that hadn't been there before. In the publication Prairie Farmer, which was published in Chicago, but had its own state divisions throughout the Midwest, there was a story of a farmer named Bert Hansen who called himself a bull stewardess when he flew 31 bulls to Guatemala. And he claimed in this story that appeared after the war that from then on, every time he looked up at an airplane flying overhead, he saw, quote, a potential cattle farm traveling through the air. And the organization seemed to be building on its success. By 1948, farmers and farm owners were the second largest group of private airplane owners in the United States, claiming 8,070 aircraft among them, which is a 39% increase over 1947. So in these immediate post-war years, is a high tide. It seems that there's an inevitable growth in aviation and the possibilities that it would present to farmers, particularly in the Midwest, who potentially saw a more delimited range of market possibilities before. The airplane was supposed to open up these boundaries, and the flying farmers would be the key organization to make this happen. So I want to back up a moment and explore, why is it exactly that this happened at this moment? How was it that airplanes became insinuated in these mid-century farms in the way that they did? And the first place is that aviation in the United States has essentially always been a rural phenomenon. Most Americans saw their first airplane in the 19 teens in a setting like this one. This is at the Wisconsin State Fair, just out of Milwaukee, but you see a similar thing happening in county fairs around the United States, but particularly in rural places. So these places that were typically reserved for the demonstration of prize livestock and quantities of different goods produced, this was the place that you were most commonly seeing an airplane for the first time. So these things were becoming very closely integrated. Many would also see barnstormers, who were typically World War I pilots using planes that were left over from the war. They would only have at their disposal farm fields to lay on. So usually they would do a low pass to warn people to clear off any livestock and then put down on the smoothest field. And in fact, if you can find in libraries old pilot's guides, and unlike today, where they would tell you what to expect at any particular airport, the dimensions of the runway, et cetera, what these early guides did is they would talk about the fields and what people planted in particular areas, what the soil was like. And so for these aviators, they had to have a relatively intimate knowledge of the landscape, of the agricultural terrain that they would be encountering. Here's another look at barnstorming pilots outside of Waukesha, Wisconsin, again, using farmers' fields to land airplanes. Oftentimes, admittedly, not fields that farmers themselves had given permission to land in. Early navigation was also one that was intimately tied to the land. And so in addition to knowing where you were landing, you needed to know the landscape because that's what you were using to navigate. And so there were these, what were identified as air lighthouses that for a brief time were even supervised by the US Lighthouse Service that dotted especially the Midwest and the Great Plains that helped pilots find their way as they went from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so even though now the middle of the country is often referred to as flyover country, originally pilots had a much more certain understanding of that terrain that they were flying over because in part they needed to land a lot more often, but also they needed to know that landscape because they were reading it to understand where exactly it was that they were going. Aviation also was very early on used to help farmers. As early as 1919, the USDA was taking aerial photographs and sharing them with farmers to understand how land was being used. But especially during the New Deal, when there were new programs that were supposed to be limiting the crops that particular farmers used, this aerial surveillance would basically be used to ensure that farmers were cooperating with what they pledged they were holding back, not putting to seed in with the USDA. It was also used to document soil erosion. This is one of the main focuses of the USDA during the New Deal. And so these images were used to demonstrate to farmers the damage that could be done if they continued to use particular practices. You can see this one is actually from 1947 when the state of Iowa initiated this Iowa Air Tour, which was again intended to give farmers a better sense of the terrain throughout the state and how they could improve their own agricultural practices. The county agent in Huntington County, Indiana, claimed that the Kodachrome photographs that he took, much like this one from the Iowa Air Tour, were far more effective in promoting soil conservation than anything he had done before in talking to farmers face to face. That this photographic evidence provided a proof that even walking the land hadn't provided in years earlier. Federal and state government is really important in promoting organizations like the Flying Farmers too, because they see aviation as key to the growth, particularly of rural areas. And so this is a publication published by the Department of Commerce, Small Airports. And you can see this sort of before and after photograph, agricultural fields. And then in the second one, an airport has been inserted, allowing for people who live in these rural areas to be more tightly connected with the surrounding countryside and distant cities. And in these plans that would be disseminated to encourage the construction of airports, you can see they had specially designed rural airports that were intended to not cut too far into existing crops. So they recommend, for example, in this 3-runway airport design, that you could still, in particular areas, grow, for example, soybeans closer to the landing strip, perhaps wheat or corn along the sides of them, and then you could have a short growing hay crop among the runways as well. So these runways, as they were promoted by individual states and the federal government, were intended to be very tightly entwined with the agricultural landscape that they would be built in. In 1946, there is a Federal Airport Act that is intended to formalize this process even more, and the state of Michigan becomes a model. And Michigan proposes that every city with 5,000 residents would have its own airfield, in that all rural areas would have their own roadside landing strip, admittedly more primitive than what would be built in these small cities, But essentially, the state is promising that anyone is going to be within a few miles of an airstrip, that air connectedness is essentially a right open to anyone living in the state. And then the state goes on to promote these plans with air tours, like the Iowa air tour we saw a moment ago, flying breakfast clubs where people would agree to gather and fly to a particular place, and the insertion of aviation into public school curricula. It's no mistake that the Flying Farmers starts at an agricultural college. And still today, there was an article a few weeks ago that Oklahoma still today maintains an aviation curriculum in some of its high schools. So this is something that has persisted to the present day. There was one airport in particular following this design built in Osceola, Iowa, and that was held up as sort of a model of agricultural airports for the country to follow. And so you have this very concerted effort by the state to promote these, the building of these airports. Of course, the other thing that really helps is World War II. Suddenly you have tens of thousands of pilots, people who had never been in an airplane before, who are getting training, are being discharged, and they're not all going to fly for commercial air carriers, right? They're returning to their previous occupation, many of them returning to farms with this knowledge. And along with that knowledge is an enormous surplus of airplanes as well. You have these old airplanes. Obviously, you're not going to use an enormous bomber in the sort of work that a farmer would do, but there were smaller airplanes available. But you also have this enormous manufacturing capacity. The people who are making the bombers that are going to Europe and to the Pacific theater are always looking ahead to the end of the war and thinking, what do we turn our focus to? How can we maintain this prosperity after the war is over? A company like Ford, of course, can just return to making passenger cars, but some of these other aviation companies need to figure it out. And so they identify farmers as the number one possibility. They have land that they can fly these things. They already are intimately familiar with machinery. They have an ability to fix tractors. And so it's sort of a natural transition to promote aviation to them as well. And farmers, because of the war, have focused ever more on efficiency. Although most farmers were able to get a deferral from the draft, many farm workers were not. And so farmers needed to become more and more efficient. They needed to rely more and more on machinery during the war because of the loss of extra hands. And so this gave them a mindset ready to accept new machinery, at least according to the thinking of the flying farmers. And so what do these farmers actually think they're doing with this new equipment that they have? Well, part of it in the immediate post-war period is much in the same way that Wallace is taking his hatching chicks to Siberia. Organizations like Heifer for Relief, now known as the Heifer Project, would take chicks, send them to places like Czechoslovakia, like Poland, that were building back after World War II. In this case, you can see these are chicks that are being flown to South Korea after that war. So part of the role of aviation is a recognition of farmers' increased global responsibility following the Second World War. This started with Lend-Lease, again, the program that Wallace was tracing on his way to the Soviet Union and China. Farmers were very aware of this program, and they knew that many of the farm goods they were sending were being flown by airplane abroad. There were reports back of eggs stamped by a familiar local egg producer sent by GIs back home. So there was this awareness that the goods that farmers were raising were actually reaching the people overseas. And so they had this sense of goods being sent by Lend-Lease. The Church of the Brethren, which oversaw heifers for relief, also flew cattle after the war to Venezuela, to European refugees who had settled there. And they later started an operation, and this is what's depicted in this image here as well, something called Operation Chicken Lift, in which they were flying chicks to Egypt and South Korea. And by 1952, there was a claim that over half of the chicks in Korea could identify their lineage back to the United States, that this program had basically helped create the foundation of the poultry stock that existed in Korea in the early 1950s. Of course, most famously is the Berlin airlift. And although farmers were not directly involved in this and actually operating the airplanes, as you can see here, these bags of flour, presumably coming from Minneapolis, were going behind what had already been called the Iron Curtain by that date, and again gave a very palpable connection between the agricultural goods that were being raised, often in the Midwest, and the recipients who were receiving them overseas. But of course, this is entirely impractical. Shipping flour by airplane makes no economical sense. And so while there may be a strategic reason to do it in the case of West Berlin in 1948, this isn't something that can continually happen throughout the 20th century. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And the final thing that I want to point to that lays the groundwork for this possibility is, again, this thing that is referred to as air-mindedness. This is, again, an advertisement that appeared in Prairie Farmer, and is arguing that no spot on Earth is more than 60 hours from your local airport. And you'll notice with these, what are called Great Circle routes, emanating from the Midwest and connecting farms there with destinations all around the world. The atom bomb, of course, helps create this sense of a much smaller world than had existed before, and aviation contributes to that as well. So on the one hand, there's this sense of fear of a third world war, but the flying farmers are instead pointing to this possibility that this opens up, that farmers are going to have this direct connection to sell their goods overseas, to connect with farmers, in the case of Wallace, to their counterparts overseas as well. And so there is some practical utility, especially among ranchers who have thousands of acres to cover. They're using airplanes to inspect, to fly out, to find livestock on their property. There's also an argument that aviation is going to end the drudgery of agriculture. And this is an enormous concern after World War II. There's been a huge move from the countryside to the city that already started, of course, in the early 20th century. It accelerates during World War II. And this is seen as a crisis moment, that nobody wants to live on the farm, that GIs don't want to go back to the farm when they come back because they move elsewhere. And so aviation is seen as something that's going to eliminate the division, essentially, between rural life and city life. There are claims that it's going to eliminate, quote unquote, class divisions that had existed before. It'll revitalize the countryside. But the limits are almost immediately clear. Most farmers aren't willing to carve out a portion of their fields, having been so focused on efficiency in the 1940s during the war, to create a landing strip. It just doesn't make economic sense. And even the chores, while it may make sense for someone with 10,000 acres to fly to find livestock, most farmers can just rely on a pickup truck to drive to the other side of their farm if they have something they need to accomplish. It's easier just to drive into town than to find somewhere where they can land near town and then get a ride from someone to actually go to the hardware store or wherever they need to go. And quite simply, the infrastructure is never built. Although there are these promises of having airports for every community in every state of the United States, it just doesn't come to pass. And there are very practical limits in how you can use an airplane on the farm. While it's good for crop dusting, it's a terrible way to sow fields. There were many different experiments in broadcasting seed from airplanes. And the immediate conclusion was it was just a very quick way to lose a vast amount of seeds and a considerable amount of money very quickly. Fertilizing by air also proved to be mostly unsuccessful for crops other than rice. And it's simply not economical to ship anything but the most high valued crops by air. And most of those are crops that are not being grown in the Midwest. By the early 1950s, the flying farmers were sort of scraping for a rationale of why they should maintain such an important place. And so there was an argument that in the midst of a nuclear war, they would serve as sort of this volunteer force that could spread food, could move people around to get them medical care. But this already illustrates in the early 50s that the possibility of the organization isn't gaining traction. And this is best illustrated, I think, in the first Flying Farmer of the Month, chosen in 1947. So this is a person named Thomas Letness, who is a farmer, but he's also a state legislator in Minnesota. And so he uses his plane to fly between his farm in the Red River Valley and St. Paul, but also his vacation home in San Diego. And obviously, most Midwestern farmers in the 1940s do not have vacation homes in places like San Diego. So immediately it becomes clear there's a financial barrier to who's actually able to own airplanes and to claim that they can use them. It's, for the most part, people with vast operations like Letness does. And so ultimately, aviation is just too capital intensive. It doesn't actually revitalize the farm like many hoped that it would. It doesn't eliminate those barriers between the countryside and the city that so many had hoped. And so it ultimately comes down to being a hobby. Some farmers do, in fact, use it. It's very useful for them. But for most of the flying farmers, it becomes a hobby instead. And so I want to conclude by bringing us back to Henry Wallace and his grandiose vision for what aviation would do. The flying farmers were so enticing in part because, in the same way that Wallace saw this bridging of the United States and the Soviet Union as creating a new frontier, there's always this search in the 20th century for a new frontier for the United States. That after the frontier is declared gone in the 1890s, there's always a search for what is going to revitalize rural life and agriculture in particular. And this is seen as another technological advance that can promise a new frontier. But of course, it isn't able to do that. It doesn't present new market. It doesn't create these new friendships in any meaningful way. It doesn't create for an open exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union as they quickly devolve into the Cold War animosity instead. And so there is no Northwest Passage, as Wallace promises aviation to the Soviet Union would be. And it's interesting because while around the world, famous airports like Schiphol, Heathrow, Narita, and Tokyo are being built, they're all being met by violent farmer protests. In the Netherlands, farmers are throwing turnips at airplanes as they land in Schiphol. And in Narita, airplanes actually needed to divert their landing routes because the farmers around the new airport were so violent in their protests that it actually posed a risk to incoming planes. By contrast, American farmers are very eager to embrace aviation. They see it as a promise. They have this sort of vision of the new frontier that it will promise, but is ultimately not able to undo the direction that agriculture is moving by the 1950s. Ever fewer farmers, ever larger farms, and ever more capital needed to grow things on the farm. And so we turn back to Wallace's wistfulness. The organization still exists, the Flying Farmers, but just never really able to grow into the thing that had envisioned. Thank you all, and I'm very eager now to take any questions that you might have. I'll stop with this slide showing the optimism of where Iowa's aviation was supposed to be going.
Thank you, Peter. We have time to answer some questions. As a reminder for our viewers, if you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. And please note, we may not be able to get to all of these questions. For starters, Peter, could you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in flying farmers and Midwest aviation?
Absolutely. This comes from a bigger book project that took too long to complete, but will finally be done in the spring, as Matthew mentioned at the beginning. And reading through copies of Prairie Farmer, the question I was interested in was, how did farmers understand their responsibility during World War II and after the war, especially with organizations like Heifers for Relief? And in the process of reading this, I started tripping over this organization called the Flying Farmers. And initially, it doesn't seem like much, but then they keep appearing over and over again. And it was an oddity that was interesting, but it also very tightly mapped onto this air-mindedness that people like Henry Wallace keep talking about, that there does really seem to be a shift in the way that people are thinking about the world. And even if it doesn't really change people's day-to-day lives, farmers aren't flying in their jitney planes to Siberia, it does at least change the way that they imagine the world and their relationship to it. So as something continually appears, you finally realize, like, this is something I need to look at, if nothing else, to sort of satisfy this curiosity. And as I mentioned, I keep finding more and more material that wasn't available when I first started looking at this. And so, although I think completed my work on this, it feels like there's more and more available, and maybe something else will come out of it in the future.
Thank you. We have a question from a viewer here. Did Midwestern farmers derive any benefit at all by investing in airplanes and airstrips?
I have no evidence. I've never come across anything in a government publication. The images like the one that I'm showing you right now from this publication called Iowans Flying, and I don't know why there's an apostrophe in there, but that's what it was called. They have that sort of flying car optimism that you see really commonly around mid-century, that there's this really fruitful future that lays ahead. But there's never any follow-up that's actually able to show that this is the benefit derived in this particular case. So again, I'm sure you could come up with a few dozen cases of primarily ranchers who used airplanes to get parts that were needed. There are cases of blizzards that hit and livestock that are stranded miles from the barn, and the rancher is able to bring food by airplane and airdrop it to them, and they survive the blizzard. But the fact that these stories get picked up in agricultural publications also sort of indicates how unique they were, that they were an attempt to justify the integration of airplanes. And the other thing that is, I guess, a sort of morose thing to share is, when I started this project, I created a Google alert for flying farmers. So anytime something got posted on Google, within the search engine on the Flying Farmers, I would be notified of it. And ever since I've done that, 99% of the things that come up are obituaries, unfortunately. It's mostly people who were members of the Flying Farmers at some point in past decades and have since died. Very rarely is there news about the Flying Farmers doing a particular thing. And so that feels like another piece of evidence of a lack of really concrete financial payoff. I think there's an enormous social payoff that came out of it. You know, it was another source of camaraderie that was really important for many of these farmers, but never the sort of economic benefit that was promised early on. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about some of the roles of these flying farmers, and this relates to a question another viewer has who's tuning in from Nebraska. How involved were the flying farmers in natural disasters in the post-war era? They mentioned, for example, you know, how many were involved in Truman's aviation relief plans for the Great Plains blizzards of 48 and 59.
Right. That's another great example where there are these very discrete cases where farmers with airplanes are employed in a very, finite amount of time to do this very particular task. And I think they could prove very valuable in those cases. But there's not a long-standing or persistent role that these aviators are able to provide. They're, again, going back to that example of imagining being this sort of post nuclear war quick response team, there's nothing like that ever really gets formed that can respond to lesser emergencies, right? It's only a near apocalypse that they can respond to. It's fewer and far between that there's something like a blizzard that they're able to respond to more immediately. So again, I don't want to deny that there was no value. There are certainly these individual instances, but they don't become integrated into, say, the USDA. They don't have as much of a standing role. They're more important, I think, in the sort of cultural importance, especially in the Cold War, right? That all Americans are involved in this struggle, and that they're all contributing, and it gets Americans to buy into it.
Great. Could you also speak a little bit to the aviator networks and communities that existed between flying farmers and other kinds of pilots who were in the region?
Absolutely. This is one of the key things that, of course, doesn't appear as much in the formal record, and is something that I think is more valuable in teasing out between members. And this is a wonderful example of something that's appearing more and more in digitized form, interviews from members of the Flying Farmers. But this is a key piece that people who maybe at an earlier stage were far enough apart that they maybe saw each other annually are now able to get together more frequently. There are many stories of farmers who are flying to Latin America, for example. So they create this connection with distant farmers that they never would have been close to as well. So again, this is where I don't want to say that there was no value at all. I think there was a really important social value that was developed because of the Flying Farmers and aviation more generally, but it was a fairly limited one. We're talking about a few thousand people after that sort of high point in 1950 who are able to take advantage of these things. And so while acknowledging how important it was, it's also something that is true of a pretty limited number of farmers in the post-war period.
Thank you so much. We have time here for one last question. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit about your forthcoming book and where we can go to learn more.
Oh, absolutely. So apparently, I just discovered this today. If you go to the University of Minnesota Press's website, there is a landing page, although the cover is not up there as well. And the flying farmers is like a very small sliver of this bigger argument that I build of, because of World War II, but even because of World War I, and then especially the Cold War, farmers begin to imagine an ever greater role. Midwestern farmers in particular get accused of isolationism, right? That they want to sort of wall themselves out from the rest of the world. And of course, this is a fable. This is never true. Farmers are always aware of what's going on in the rest of the world. They're always tied in to markets, to networks of information and seeds. But during World War II, they really become a driving force in creating the post-war world, in making the United States the global power that it is, creating networks with farmers in the rest of the world, contributing to overseas development. And so while we know how important agriculture was to the Cold War and sending the US mission abroad, part of what I have uncovered is how important the farmers themselves were to this, how they saw themselves not as people isolated in the middle of the continent, but rather saw themselves at the middle of the world, that they were contributing to the work of agriculture that was happening everywhere, and really saw a commonality with people, much in the same way that, for all of his flaws, Wallace did as well.
We look forward to checking out your work. And with that, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. We'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Peter. We hope that everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on July 25th. The topic will be the Tri-States Ballrooms and Bands. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.